For years, he was just another cab driver picking up soldiers from the base, until one young pilot heard him mumble radio codes under his breath and realized who was behind the wheel. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of forgotten wings and quiet courage, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe legends like this need to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure they are. The yellow cab had seen better days. Paint peeling around the wheel wells, a crack spider webbing across the windshield, and a radio that crackled more than it spoke, but ran. And that's all Frank Martinez needed. Every morning at 0600, he'd fire up the engine, adjust his rearview mirror with the same precise angle, and begin his route. Frank had been driving taxi for 12 years. Same car, same routes, same quiet efficiency that never drew attention. The dispatcher knew him as reliable. The airport staff knew him as punctual. The soldiers from Nellis Air Force Base knew him as the driver who never asked questions and never took the long way around. What they didn't know was why. Frank wore the same thing every day: faded jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and a blue baseball cap that had once been Navy regulation. No patches, no insignia, nothing that would make you look twice. His hands were weathered but steady on the wheel, and his eyes, sharp, constantly scanning, never quite matched the tired routine of his movements. The soldiers liked him because he was quiet. No small talk about the weather, no political opinions, no questions about where they'd been or where they were going. Just hop in and that'll be $23.50. In a world where everyone had something to say, Frank Martinez was a man who simply drove. But Lieutenant Sarah Chen noticed something different that Tuesday morning. She'd been stationed at Nellis for 8 months, flying F-35s and trying to prove herself in a squadron that still thought women belonged behind desks, not in cockpits. She was tired, running on 3 hours of sleep after a red-eye training mission when she climbed into the back of Frank's cab outside the base gate. McCarran Airport, Sarah said, settling into the worn vinyl seat. Terminal 1. Frank nodded once and pulled into traffic. Sarah leaned back, closing her eyes and trying to decompress from a night of formation, flying, and instrument checks. The cab was quiet except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle from the radio. That's when she heard it. Soft, almost inaudible, like someone thinking out loud. Frank was mumbling something under his breath as he navigated the early morning traffic. Sarah opened her eyes, listening more carefully. Charlie Delta 7, maintain 12000, vector 270. Frank muttered quietly. Sarah sat up straighter. Those weren't random words. Those were air traffic control protocols, standard ATC communication patterns that every pilot knew by heart. But why would a taxi driver be reciting them? She watched Frank in the rearview mirror. His eyes were focused on the road, but his lips were moving slightly, continuing the quiet stream of aviation terminology that no civilian should know. Roger Tower, descending to flight level 280, request approach clearance. Frank continued under his breath. Sarah's pulse quickened. This wasn't someone who'd heard these phrases on TV or in movies. This was someone who'd lived them, breathed them, spoken them into a headset while flying at 30,000 feet. Excuse me, Sarah said quietly. Frank's eyes flicked to the mirror, meeting hers for just a moment before returning to the road. Yes, ma'am. Those radio calls you were just making, where did you learn those? Sarah asked. The cab went silent. Frank's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, but he didn't answer right away. They drove for another mile before he finally spoke. Old habits, Frank said simply. But Sarah wasn't satisfied. She'd been flying long enough to recognize the difference between someone who'd memorized a few phrases and someone who spoke the language fluently. Frank had been using proper call signs, correct altitudes, standard approach procedures. This wasn't a hobby or casual interest. You were a pilot, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Frank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Long time ago. What did you fly? Sarah pressed. Another long pause. They were approaching the airport now, the control tower visible in the distance. Frank pulled into the departure lane and put the cab in park. He turned slightly, just enough to meet Sarah's eyes in the mirror. Different kind of flying than you do, Lieutenant, Frank said quietly. Sarah's breath caught. He knew her rank. She hadn't told him she was military, hadn't mentioned her position. Her uniform was in her bag. She was wearing civilian clothes. But somehow he knew. "How did you?" Sarah began. "Posture," Frank said quietly. "Eyes. The way you scan when you think no one's looking. Takes one to know one." Sarah stared at him, her mind racing. "What kind of flying?" Frank turned back toward the wheel, his voice dropping even lower. "The kind they don't put in newspapers." He reached for the meter, but Sarah leaned forward. "Wait, please." "Like what aircraft?" For a moment, Frank didn't move. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, he said two letters that made her blood run cold. "SAR." Sarah's mouth went dry. "SAR." There was only one aircraft designation that started with those letters, and it was the stuff of legends. The SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest, highest-flying reconnaissance aircraft ever built, so classified that most of its missions were still blacked out decades later. "The Blackbird?" Sarah whispered. Frank didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. He just looked at the meter and said, 2350. Sarah handed him a 20 and a 10, her hands trembling slightly. "Keep the change." As she got out of the cab, Frank finally spoke again. "Lieutenant," she turned back. "Some things are better left in the sky," Frank said quietly, and then he drove away, leaving Sarah standing on the curb with more questions than answers and the growing realization that she'd just shared a ride with a ghost. Sarah couldn't let it go. For 3 days, she thought about nothing else. The way Frank had recited those radio procedures, the precision of his terminology, the quiet authority in his voice when he'd identified her as military, and those two letters, SR. She'd grown up on stories of the SR-71. Every pilot had. It was the ultimate aircraft, a titanium bird that could outrun missiles and photograph entire countries from the edge of space. But the program had been so classified that even decades after its retirement, most of the pilots' identities remained secret. Could a man who'd once flown at Mach 3.3 really be driving a beat-up taxi in Las Vegas? Sarah started asking around carefully. She couldn't just walk up to her squadron mates and say she thought she'd met a Blackbird pilot in a cab. They'd think she was losing it. Instead, she began researching. The SR-71 program had operated from 1966 to 1998. Only a handful of pilots had ever been cleared to fly it. Maybe 93 men total over the entire program's life. Their names weren't public record, their missions weren't acknowledged. They were the ultimate Black Project pilots, sworn to secrecy that extended far beyond their service. But every pilot left traces. Sarah spent her off-duty hours in the base library, digging through declassified documents and old Aviation Week articles. She found references to test pilots, to mysterious flights out of Edwards and Beale Air Force bases, to men who disappeared from the normal progression of military aviation careers. One name kept appearing in the margins, Lieutenant Colonel Francisco Frank Martinez, a test pilot who'd been assigned to classified programs in the 1980s and 1990s. No details about what he'd flown, no mission records, just a notation that he'd been transferred to special duties and then abruptly retirement. The timing matched, the name matched, and the pieces started falling into place. Sarah found an old group photo from Edwards AFB circa 1987. 30 pilots posed in front of a hangar, their faces young and confident. In the back row, third from the left, stood a man with dark hair and sharp eyes. The caption listed him as Let Call F. Martinez. She studied the face carefully, comparing it to her memory of the taxi driver. Older now, grayer, worn by decades of carrying secrets. But the eyes were the same, the posture was the same. And when she looked at the way he stood, feet slightly apart, shoulders back, eyes scanning the horizon, she knew. Frank Martinez hadn't just been any pilot. He'd been one of the ghosts, one of the men who'd pushed the envelope of what was possible, who'd flown higher and faster than anyone else in history. And now he was driving a cab. Sarah waited 3 weeks before calling for another taxi from the base. She specifically requested Frank's cab number, claiming he'd been recommended by a friend. When the yellow car pulled up, she felt her heart rate spike. This time, she was ready. "Airport again?" Frank asked as she settled into the back seat. "Actually," Sarah said, "could we just drive for a bit? I'll pay for the time." Frank's eyes found hers in the mirror. Something in her tone must have warned him, because his posture shifted slightly. More alert, more guarded. "Where to?" Frank asked. "Anywhere. I just want to talk." Sarah replied. They drove in silence for several minutes, Frank navigating through the Vegas traffic with the same quiet efficiency she remembered. But this time, Sarah was watching everything. The way he checked his mirrors, not like a taxi driver worried about fares, but like someone trained to watch for threats. The way his hands rested on the wheel, loose but ready, like they'd once gripped a stick at 80,000 feet. You looked me up? Frank said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. How did you? Base library computers keep logs. Your access records to classified archives got flagged. Word gets around, Frank explained matter-of-factly. Sarah swallowed hard. She'd been so careful, but apparently not careful enough. I needed to know. Why? Frank asked. Because what you did, what you all did, it matters, and you're driving a taxi like none of it happened, Sarah said with emotion in her voice. Frank pulled into a parking lot overlooking the Vegas Valley. The city sprawled below them, a grid of lights and dreams built in the middle of nowhere. He turned off the engine and sat quietly for a long moment. You know what the SR-71 could do? Frank finally asked. Mach 3. 3. Altitude ceiling of 85,000 feet. Reconnaissance missions over. Sarah began reciting. No, Frank interrupted. Not the stats. What it could really do. Sarah waited. It could make you forget you were human, Frank said quietly. Up there, at that speed, at that altitude, you weren't a person anymore. You were part of the machine. Pure thought and reaction, moving faster than sound, higher than most people ever dreamed of going. He turned to look at her through the partition. And when you came down, when you had to pretend to be normal again, had to sit in meetings and talk about grocery lists and weather, it was like living underwater. So, you just stopped? Sarah asked. Frank's laugh was bitter. I didn't stop. They stopped me. Mandatory retirement. Full pension, nice ceremony, handshake from the base commander. Thank you for your service, Colonel Martinez. Enjoy civilian life. But why taxi driving? Sarah pressed. Because, Frank said, it's the only job I could find where I get to watch the sky. Sarah looked up through the windshield. Above them, the lights of aircraft moved across the darkness like slow-moving stars. Commercial flights, military transports, the ordinary traffic of a world that moved at speeds Frank had once left behind in seconds. Do you miss it? Sarah asked softly. Frank was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Then, barely audible, he said, Every day. They sat in silence, watching the planes overhead. Finally, Frank started the engine again. 2350, Frank said. But this time, Sarah didn't get out when they reached the base. Instead, she handed him her card. If you ever want to talk to someone who understands what it's like to live for flying, Sarah said, call me. Frank looked at the card for a long moment. Then he tucked it into his shirt pocket. Ma'am? Frank said. Yes? Sarah replied. For what it's worth, you've got good eyes. Most people never see past the uniform, Frank said with respect. Sarah smiled. Most people never flew at Mach 3. As she walked toward the base gate, she heard Frank call after her. Lieutenant? Frank called out. She turned. Keep your altitude. The view's better from up there, Frank said with a slight smile. Word spread quietly through the pilot community at Nellis. Not officially, not through channels, but the way information moves among people who understand what it means to push past the edge of the possible. Sarah never told anyone directly, but somehow they knew. A retired Air Force colonel was driving taxi in Vegas. A man who'd once been among the most elite pilots in the world was picking up $20 fares and keeping his mouth shut about missions that were still classified. The first to reach out was Major Tom Bradley, an F-22 pilot who'd heard the story third hand. He called Frank's cab company specifically, requesting the driver who knew the area well. When Frank picked him up, Tom was in civilian clothes, but the conversation was immediate. Colonel Martinez? Tom asked respectfully. Frank's hands tightened on the wheel. Just Frank now. Tom Bradley, Major, 422nd Test and Evaluation Squadron. Sir, it's an honor, Tom said. Where to, Major? Frank asked, maintaining his professional demeanor. Tom gave an address, but as they drove, he continued talking. My dad was crew chief on the U-2 program. He always said the Blackbird guys were in a league of their own. Frank didn't respond, but Tom caught his eyes in the mirror. He's gone now. Cancer. But he used to tell me stories about watching you guys take off. Said it was like watching someone light a candle on the surface of the sun, Tom said with admiration. They drove the rest of the way in silence, but when Tom got out, he left a $100 bill for a $30 fare. "For what it's worth, sir," Tom said through the window, "some of us remember." After that, the calls came regularly. Pilots from Nellis, visiting officers, even some civilian contractors who'd worked on classified programs. They never said much during the rides, never pushed for details about missions or aircraft specifications. They just wanted to sit in the presence of someone who'd been where they'd only dreamed of going. Frank never acknowledged what was happening directly, but Sarah noticed changes. His posture was straighter. His voice carried more authority. The radio protocols he mumbled under his breath became more frequent, more confident, like he was remembering who he used to be. One evening, Sarah got a call from the base operator. "Lieutenant Chen, you have a civilian visitor at the main gate. Says his name is Frank Martinez." Sarah's heart skipped. She'd given Frank her card months ago, but he'd never called. She authorized his entry and met him at the squadron building. He was standing by the flagpole, looking up at the F-35s parked on the tarmac. In the fading sunlight, wearing his usual jeans and t-shirt, he looked smaller than she remembered. But his eyes were watching the aircraft like a man who understood what they represented. "Frank?" He turned. "Lieutenant, hope you don't mind me stopping by." "Not at all. What's up?" Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a pair of silver wings. Not the standard pilot wings that Sarah wore, but something different, more angular, more aggressive. The wings of a test pilot. "I wanted to give you something," he said. "These were mine, back when I was flying operational test missions, before the Blackbird, before any of it." Sarah stared at the wings. They were worn smooth in places, the silver dulled by decades of handling. "Frank, I can't." "Yes, you can." He closed the box and pressed it into her hands. "Because you're the first person in 12 years who looked at me and saw a pilot instead of a taxi driver." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "Why are you giving these to me?" Frank looked back at the aircraft on the tarmac. "Because somebody needs to remember that we were more than the machines we flew. We were the people who believed impossible was just another word for challenging." He started to walk away, then paused. "And Lieutenant, that thing I told you about keeping your altitude? Yes? I was wrong. Don't just keep it. Gain it. Always be climbing." Sarah watched him walk back toward the gate, a quiet man in ordinary clothes, carrying extraordinary memories. She opened the box again, looking at the wings that had once been pinned to the chest of someone who'd touched the edge of space. That night, she called the taxi company and requested Frank's number. When he answered, she said, "Frank, it's Sarah. I was wondering, would you like to come watch some takeoffs tomorrow? I'm scheduled for a training flight, and I thought maybe you'd like to see what we're doing with the new generation." There was a long pause. Then, quietly, Frank said, "I'd like that very much." The next morning, Frank stood at the edge of the tarmac wearing a visitor's badge and watching Sarah Chen run through her pre-flight checks. He'd been given clearance to observe the training exercise, something that almost never happened for civilians. But word had gotten around about who he was, and sometimes the military took care of its own. As Sarah's F-35 taxied toward the runway, Frank raised his hand slightly. A small gesture, barely visible, but Sarah saw it. The salute of one pilot to another, crossing decades and aircraft types, and the vast difference between what had been possible then and what was possible now. The afterburners lit, and the Lightning II accelerated down the runway, climbing steeply into the Nevada sky. Frank watched until it was just a speck against the blue, then longer still until even the contrail had dissolved. "Beautiful aircraft," said a voice behind him. Frank turned. A young airman was standing nearby, maybe 19 or 20, wearing the stripes of a crew chief. "Yes," Frank agreed quietly, "it is." "You ever fly, sir?" the airman asked with curiosity. Frank looked at the kid, earnest, eager, probably dreaming of wings he might never earn. For a moment he considered giving his usual answer. "Just drove here, just watching." Instead, he said, "Once upon a time." "What did you fly?" the airman pressed. Frank smiled, the first real smile he'd worn in years. "The fastest thing that ever had wings." The airman's eyes widened. "No kidding. What was it like?" Frank looked back at the sky where Sarah's aircraft was just beginning its descent pattern. Like touching the face of God, Frank said quietly, and having to come back down and pretend it never happened. Later that afternoon, Frank Martinez called the taxi company and gave his notice. The next week, he started a new job at the Las Vegas Aviation Museum, giving tours to school children and telling carefully edited stories about the history of flight. He never mentioned the Blackbird directly, but sometimes, when a particularly sharp kid asked about the fastest planes ever built, Frank would get a distant look in his eyes and say, "Some things are so fast, so high, that they exist more in dreams than in reality. But they were real. And the people who flew them, they were real too." Sarah kept the wings on her desk, polished to a mirror shine, and every time she climbed into her aircraft, she thought about the man who'd once flown higher than angels and faster than sound, who'd carried the weight of impossible missions in silence for 12 years, until someone finally looked close enough to see the pilot underneath the uniform. Because that's the thing about legends. They don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they drive taxis and mumble radio calls under their breath, waiting for someone wise enough to listen to the language they still speak fluently, even when the world has moved on without them. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Frank Martinez? Someone whose quiet presence suggested depths you couldn't imagine, whose ordinary job hid an extraordinary past? Share their story in the comments. Tell us who they were before the world stopped watching. Thank you for watching The Human Stories. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who believes that heroes don't always wear their medals on the outside. Sometimes they carry them quietly, one ride at a time, waiting for the moment when someone remembers to look up at the sky and remember who helped make it possible. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, if you ever find yourself in the back of a taxi and hear the driver speaking a language that sounds like dreams, listen carefully. You might be sitting behind someone who once touched the stars.